So this is going to be really simple. What we're going to do is I'm asking our guests to have some opening statements about what they think about this piece, what they think the significance of this piece is. Both of them will say that, and then we're going to throw it open to your questions, and they will talk as you ask your questions some more. So I'd like to, first of all, thank both of our guests for being here with us today. We'll give them some hand before we get here. That's right. Give them some love. I really admire both of these gentlemen's work very, very much. But I'm not going to say anything more because we got 15 minutes and we know we got to do a story. We are recording this, so we are going to post this online this evening. Okay?
Okay, sure. So it sounds like Irma mentioned to you that I'm just fresh off of the jury process for the Peabody Awards. And I'm a terrible tease because I can't tell you whether this piece won an award or not. The awards won't be announced till next week.
Monday.
But it's a given that this is a piece we needed to deal with very intensely and closely as we were looking at the Peabody Awards this year. And I can say that I supported this piece getting a Peabody Award. I think I'm safe saying both of those without violating my rules. And I'm going to try to explain why in the language we use in thinking about those awards. So the first, we use really two categories. I mean, the interesting thing about the Peabodys is there are no categories, right? We consider pieces across the full spectrum of audiovisual media. We consider radio, we consider television, we consider web-based materials. We don't consider games and we don't consider film. But documentary films that end up on television do get considered. So it's part of a larger process. We typically talk about two things: stories that matter and excellence on its own terms. And those are the criteria we're encouraged to think about. So if we look at this through stories that matter, the question would be, in what sense does serial matter? At the most basic level, it's a game changer for audio media in the United States. Right? Podcasts have been around for well over a decade. There has been outstanding and interesting work done in podcasts. We have been seeing mounting over the last decade radio coming really back into its own, and each year we're seeing better and better work in radio. But this was just the killer app of the podcast. The number of people who downloaded Serial, who listened obsessively to it, who learned what podcasts were, and have spread out and started consuming a range of other podcasts makes this a really significant event, above and beyond content and form. Just in terms of what the impact on the media was, Serial is really important. And as you do that, then you discover, or get reacquainted with things like 99% Invisible, things like State of the Reunion, a number of other long forms of journalistic reporting, exploration of the world that I think are really worth paying attention to. What the work that StoryCorps is doing. Shifting entertainment-wise, Welcome to Night Vale, or thrilling adventure stories, or the LA Theater Works Project, or Story Pirates, all doing really interesting work in the audio medium. So this is where some of the real excitement in media is taking place right now. Stories that matter, in a second sense, is this sparked an enormous conversation. And so when we look at journalistic pieces, we look at impact. Did it change laws and policies? Did it free someone who was unjustly imprisoned? And in this case, probably neither of those. But the case I would make was that this is a work that got us thinking about the notion of innocence until proven guilty, reasonable doubt, the criteria by which we think about who should be in jail in this country. Because most of the time, if you watch fictional television program, the question of doubt never enters the equation. The old Perry Mason thing was someone, confesses on the witness stand and they've carted off. Good Wife does a little better than that. There is some ambiguity sometimes on Good Wife, but I say in most of the cases, you're pretty clear who's guilty and innocent by the end of the episode. News does no better. I'd say news, if anything, today starts from a presumption of guilty from the minute a suspect is identified, and it's really hard to shift the news coverage away from that frame, which is why when a verdict is overturned or when something doesn't go as expected, it becomes a crisis for journalism. They don't know how to deal with it. So I would say Serial is an extended meditation on this notion of the nature of guilt, the nature of evidence, the nature of proof. And that more than any other outcome is what was important there. Getting people attentive to the Innocence Project and getting massive number of people contributing money, time, resources, and support to the Innocence Project is an important outcome in and of itself. Whether they nailed who did it at the end of the day is less interesting to me and less important to me than that we followed this path that led us to look just closely at evidence and really weight it. And the behind the show is Tumblr and Reddit and all of these other sites where people were doing what Maureen Ryan at the Huffington Post called pushboard tactics. They was putting up maps, evidence, timelines, speculating, thinking it through. And around that then was this whole debate about journalistic ethics, about the nature of crime coverage, so forth. And the show has succeeded in paving the way for a whole new generation of true crime stories that we're going to see more and more of. So the question then of is excellence on its own terms, for me, often boils down to a question of genre. What kind of thing is it that we're looking at, and what is the criteria we should use in assessing a piece like this one? And doing this discussion in a journalism classroom pushes it toward the journalism category that I'm not sure it belongs in. And I think the question of whether this is a piece of journalism is one that I want to hold at a little bit skeptical of as we go forward, because we can also think of it as a variety of other things. So it comes from This American Life, right? That's the heritage it comes out of. For much of its history, This American Life has been mostly about people telling their own stories, right? The pieces on This American Life are autobiographical pieces, they're confessional pieces. They owe as much to the world of blogs and podcasts as they owe to any traditional news reporting. In the last handful of years, This American Life has begun to do some work that's documentary-like. So last year, This American Life won a Peabody for a year-long study of a school in Chicago that was in a gang district, and it was basically a cinema verite piece if it had been a film. It was the voices recorded in the hallways, at the teachers' meetings, in the teachers' lounge, people talking and what happened over the course of the year at this high school, with a little bit of fact-checking, a little bit of background. Now, whether that's journalism or not, I don't know. It's documentary for sure. It's like Frederick Wiseman's documentaries. It's like a Robert Drew documentary. It fits in a documentary tradition, but less so. This year, they proposed two pieces. One was an undercover piece about the Fed, where a woman who worked for the Fed had a tape recorder in her pen and recorded some of the meetings of the regulators talking to the banks and shared that. And it was chilling stuff, but again, the woman got fired. After she got fired, she turned this over to This American Life. They edited it together. Is that journalism or not? Again, it's documentary, but maybe not journalism. So if we think about Serial as coming out of that autobiographical tradition, coupled with some kinds of investigation that's more documentary-like, we begin to see where it might come from. The other heritage, I would say, is new journalism, right? So when I looked at the piece, I thought about it alongside Truman Capote's work in True Blood, for example, in the crime genre. I thought about the work that Tom Wolfe has done, or the work that Hunter S. Thompson did, or the work that George Plimpton did, all writers who made themselves and their process of recording, engaging with the world, part of the stories they told. Truman Capote took far more license with the truth than anyone's ever claimed Serial has done, right? And yet came away with a sense that while probably not totally factual, In True Blood spoke the truth about the nature of crime in America and helped us understand things in new ways. So when we think about new journalism, it's partially a journalism that doesn't claim objectivity, but claims reflexivity, claims some degree of transparency, claims to be revealing its thinking processes and inviting us to be skeptical at every step along the way of what's being told. So some critics of the Serial have said it's irresponsible for them to air theories that haven't been established by journalistic criteria. And my question would be is if we had had the trial of our dreams, where a defense attorney was adequately defending the Saeed and was presenting a series of counter theories that were intended to test this question of guilty beyond doubt or guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, we would have aired a theory that said Jay might have been involved in the crime. And it would have been reported in journalism as something that was said at the trial. The theory would have been reported, the suspicions would have been out there, the public would have been encouraged to think about those suspicions in an open way, and no one would have blamed the journalist that that theory was out there. Instead, what Serial does is say, here's some possibility, here's the evidence for it, here's the evidence against it. Don't trust us. We're not saying we figured out what happened. We're saying we're trying to walk through a train of evidence, sift through memories, help people think critically about what counts as proof that a crime happened, given we can't be there, that we don't have adequate way of knowing what actually took place in this crime. What is going to allow us to think through these possibilities? And by putting that skepticism in it at every step along the way, to me, it absolves it of some of the culpability that surrounds many other forms of crime reporting, which are representing it as fact even before those facts have been fully verified. And that happens on CNN with the 24-hour news cycle all the time. We throw out things as fact that proven not to be true. This is saying don't trust us. In that sense, I put it in the same category as Earl Morris's Thin Blue Line. Right? And in that film, Earl Morris does reenactments, which are anathema of most of the journalists and documentary producers on the Peabody board. They hate reenactments. But what it does with reenactments is to represent visually every claim made about the case, and to keep changing the visual representation as we hear different witnesses and they describe their versions of the event. So they're all equally real, equally tangible, but no, they're at the same time, they're on quote marks. Because they're reenactments, we're asked to question at every step along the way, was that really how it happened? And I think the accomplishment of Serial is that it almost never makes a factual claim that is not almost immediately undercut by another factual claim. It's constantly saying the world, shifting the sand out from underneath us and inviting us to think skeptically about the world. And that's what I think may be what's valuable about Serial as we think about it in relation to the future of media. Now, is that journalism? Probably not. It doesn't meet the ethical standards a journalist would apply, but it's also not making the same kinds of truth claims that journalism would have made and covering the same story. And so for me, it's in a different genre. And so the criteria by which I'm assessing it has to do with the ways it uses its media, the ways it's constructing an experience for the viewer, and the ways in which it tries to be self-aware and self-critical of its construction of the truth.
Okay.
So I'll stop there.
All right. So we've heard one point of view on Serial, and I think he explained very definitely where he's coming from. The question of whether or not it's journalism, actually, I never even thought about that way, because for me, it's not really, it is journalism in many ways. But the way you slice it, I can understand why it would be debatable. But now let's hear from the journalist. What do you think about this? By the way, I did plug your new book, and they're all going to buy it, Sandy.
Oh,
all right.
Very
Children
good.
of the Stone. Okay.
Skyrocket.
Okay.
Yeah, so well, there's a lot to think about in what you just said, and starting with the question of whether journalism, which could take us the entire class and the rest of the semester, right? I would define journalism broadly, as I think maybe Erna is inclined to do, given what she just said. And I would say, yes, it is journalism, and new journalism is journalism, and I think a broader definition of journalism is something I would embrace, and so I would say this is journalism. I mean, I want to start by agreeing with a great deal, the majority of what you're saying, especially about the impact and the sort of the newness for the culture. I think the idea that, I think I read from a comment that Ira Glass of This American Life made, that in the first month, I believe, there were 1 million downloads a week. And he said, it took This American Life a year to get there. So this is an incredible phenomenon. It is a phenomenon in large part because it was launched by This American Life. It had been relatively anonymous. It would never have gotten, it was the fact that it had this incredible national introduction is a large part, in my view, of why it was so popular. But of course, if it wasn't so engaging, it never would have gotten there either. And I think it's also, as a journalist and as someone who's been teaching radio for a long time, including since I came here in 2008, I think it's amazing that while the whole journalistic culture, starting with USA Today years ago and CNN headline news and now public radio, everything is getting crunched into smaller and smaller formats. By and large, that's the general trend, right? So like years ago, in the early 90s, I did a series called Vanishing Homelands for NPR. The average length of the story was about 17 minutes. We had a lot of 22, 25-minute pieces. We used to say, we can't tell that story in 8 minutes. And now you'll never get 8 minutes to tell a story. And my class has been working on pieces that each year we try to do something with KQED or one of the other, which has got the California Report, or one of the other KCRW. And they're saying, oh, can you do 5 minutes? Can you do 4.5? Can you do 4? And this year is like, we'd really like 3-minute pieces from you. So one of the other things to celebrate about this is that it shows that people have a hunger for story, right? They have a hunger for story well told in long formats. And this is going against all the so-called audience market research, which has been going on in public radio and elsewhere for all these years. And it's certainly not alone, and This American Life itself is an example of that. Radio Lab, I don't know, how many of you have ever listened to Radio Lab? I highly recommend it. It's super engaging. There's a bunch of other examples. So in that way, the fact that it's created this sort of engagement and that it's created a national conversation, I agree with all of that with you, Henry. I have some problems with it. And I mean, part of them are personal, stylistic. I find Sarah Koenig to be a little whiny, and sometimes more than a little whiny. That's her style. That's her right to have her style. It's maybe part of the quirkiness that some people find attractive. So I will leave that aside because that's more of my personal reaction. I think, where I'm not sure I agree completely with you, Henry, and I think you've made the point very well about, the thing about if Jay had been, the story of Jay had been reported in the press, that would have come out. But I think what happened to Jay as a result of the format in which this was reported is problematic, or one can argue that anyway. I mean, the thing is that I don't know if any of you have read the Natasha Vargas Cooper, the daughter of our colleague Mark Cooper. She did a 3-part series in The Intercept that basically, from my view, completely destroyed the argument or even the implication that Jay had any guilt in this whatsoever. So in like 15 minutes of reading, you could understand what you didn't understand in 12 weeks of listening. I think that's problematic, and one of the pieces that I would invite you to go back to, I don't think it was on your particular reading list, although I love those readings, was something from, let's see, let me find out who it is. It's somebody named, I think it's Jessica Weinstein. I'm just trying to find the exact reference to it. Jessica Goldstein. She went and interviewed several ethicists, including the dean of the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism, who's a guy named Ed Wasserman. And he talked about the problem with having these things come out slowly and episodically is sometimes you withhold information, or sometimes you're developing information that you don't yet have. And what Wasserman calls it, and Goldstein call it, is the potential for accidental defamation. This is a piece that was written in Think Progress. And I think that's problematic because when I was listening to this, I kept thinking, wow, Jay, I mean, this guy, I mean, really, we should question what's going on here, because Jay, it appears that Jay may well be withholding all this information. And then you get to read the Jay interview, and it sounded as though pretty much of an ambush-style interview, as nervous as Sarah Koenig and Julie Snyder were when they came over to his house. They felt completely railroaded, and this is very well described in the three-part series by Natasha Vargas Cooper that I recommend to you. So I think the problem of an innocent person who, I mean, I don't know that he's innocent any more than anybody else except for maybe Jay himself knows, but I suspect that he's innocent, and I suspect that information could have been more available with some better reporting at the time. And although I didn't look at it closely, I understand that Jay was really brutalized in Reddit. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that's problematic.
That was a whole thread. He did it.
Right, and so, right, that's why I wasn't able to find that this morning, but so that is problematic, and I don't know that that level of virulence would have happened in the reporting of a trial. So I think there's this problem of accidental, so-called accidental defamation. The other issue that I have with it, and you know, I'm a white reporter who's has been the only white person in the room in so many stories that I've done over the last 30 years. I'm not in a position to criticize people for, you know, venturing outside of their race to try to understand a cultural phenomenon. I would be a hypocrite to say that. At the same time, I do think the other problem that I have with this is that she did not understand the level of problems that a Muslim American would have with suspicion. And this is pointed out, I think, by Jason Koenig, Jason Kang in the OWL piece. And it's also pointed out elsewhere. I mean, the notion that Muslims would not be suspect, that there would not be a jury that would be inherently biased against a Muslim American, and the fact that she dismissed that so readily, to me, is really problematic. And the fact that she was white contributes to this, but also there's a certain lack of understanding of previous reporting and of empathy into the situation of someone who is an immigrant and someone who was grown up with privilege, be it white privilege, which exists in this case, or any other kind of privilege. So to me, those are the two things that are really legitimate criticisms. Not to say that just because someone's white, they don't have the right to venture into the reporting of people of other race, or vice versa, right? But it is to say that sort of an extra sensitivity and effort to understand the situation that somebody's in is required. And I think she failed, at least in that episode, when she begins to sort of to say, I didn't really think that was much of an issue, when the mother describes some of the inherent bias that she felt. At the same time, though, I'll go back to one of the things that Henry said at the beginning, which is we are sitting here talking about this in a journalism class, one of probably hundreds of conversations like this that has happened in the last few months. That is amazing, coming out of a podcast. Again, the podcast is popular because of how it was done, because of the quality of storytelling that engaged, although I did feel it kind of fell off a little bit about 2/3 of the way through. But it was really engaging, and it got a launch from This American Life, which is no coincidence in relationship to its success. So I think there are a lot of other wonderful podcasts out there that aren't getting attention because it doesn't. In fact, I was at a public radio conference in Chicago, the Third Coast Festival, which is a wonderful conference, and there were a lot of podcast people who were grumbling about the fact, well, I didn't get any launch from This American Life. On the other hand, they probably didn't produce something that's quite that engaging either. So I'll stop there.
Okay.
So can I respond a little bit, and then we'll. So yeah, I think we're largely in agreement. I share both sets of concerns that you raised there. I mean, I did read that interview with Jay, and I have to say I don't buy his story much more than I bought it in the context of the show. And I think I'm glad that we have it. I've been wanting that story all along, but I think for us to say that it proves him innocent depends on whether we buy what he tells us about what happened in that event. And there are holes that if I was Sarah Koenig and I had that interview, I'd start to pull at the sense that this guy who doesn't know him very well, that who's been described, he describes as closed, sort of vaguely odd when he smokes pot, but other than that, they've had no real close bonding, chooses him out of the blue and invites him over to help get rid of a dead girlfriend and a car, or chooses out of the blue to start confessing to him his rage on this. There's something missing to me in that account that I keep wanting to pull at and say, all right, there's more layers of work that needs to be done on this before I'm convinced of that. I do think he probably got a raw deal, but it's also partially his choice not to fully participate in the production of this project. And it seemed to me that most of what Sarah's reported of saying to him were things that I've heard other reporters say to other sources, right? Rightly or wrongly. And we can dig into the ethics of, how you get someone who doesn't want to talk to you, and there's some interesting questions there. But I don't think it's outside of the realm of the journalistic practice I've seen in my limited exposure to the newsroom to say that she's probably followed pretty close to her standard operating procedure. It got dicey, yes, and I'm sure anyone who covered these kind of emotionally drawn things would have moments that things got out of hand. But I don't think even in this piece that she comes across as a bad journalist, if that's the criteria we're going to use here. Now, my point about the trial is the defense's job at a trial is to raise the prospect of other suspects, right? A good defense attorney doesn't just say, this proves my client did it. They shift the suspicion onto someone else. And a reporter covering a trial where a defense attorney is shifting suspicion onto someone else would represent that view, and it would then be part of a conversation. Now, what happens in the world of Reddit is a very different matter, right? Reddit is full of people who are trying to take the information, stretch it, weigh it, coming at it from every angle. And yes, Reddit, in that process, raises and deepens suspicions and poses counter theories that then, if in the middle of that process you take that out and report it as news, you've then amplified something. And that's what happened, I think, with Reddit, the Boston bombing case, where they explored a lot of ideas, maybe irresponsibly to explore them that much in public. On the other hand, this is in part how collective intelligence works, where people pool knowledge, debate it, weigh it, and then come away with a sense of what's true and what isn't. And it's a process, not a product, is what someone in Reddit would say. It's a process of trying to get to the truth that's being done in a more transparent and public way. And they're not presenting their speculations as truth. But if at any moment in time you remove it and say that's the product of the process, it could look bad. And if you're Jay and your reputation is being publicly weighed by thousands of people on a public social media channel, that is absolutely totally different from the experience, I think, that a suspect would have in any other prior moment in human history. And we have to decide what the ethics there are, what's going on. But that to me is a separate question from what Serial did. The issue of race, I think, is where I absolutely agree. And I think it's problematic, and This American Life has a real bad reputation for white privilege and self-indulgence. If you haven't seen this Orange is the New Black, I'd recommend watching the sequence there that deals with the husband of the woman who's been thrown in jail, recounting his suffering while his wife is in jail because he's alone. And that becomes the focal point of This American Life. It's a very whiny piece that he does. And then he retells the story of all these women, mostly women of color, in prison, and rewrites it in a variety of ways according to his racial stereotypes. And it goes out as truth. And so we see him on This American Life telling the story, and we see the black women in the prison listening on the radio and getting more and more angry at how their lives and their world are being represented by the show. And it seems that moment is very apropos to what these critiques of Serial have had to say.
One little very small addition, and this is a question for all of you, for all of us. The other problem I forgot to mention I had with the series was her decision to get into the incident in which Adnan stole money from the mosque. I felt like it didn't have anything to do with the case, and it was something. I mean, she has a right as a journalist to do that, but I felt like it was gratuitous and something that really did not serve the story, but rather served her own obsession for getting everything, getting into every aspect of the story. I didn't think it was worthwhile, but I'll end with that.
Okay.
You guys have some questions.
We have some questions.
Am I,
Acoustics are so bad, we have to do this.
Yeah, this room is a difficult one sound-wise.
I find it very difficult.
Hi. I wanted to go back to when we were talking about serials like truth claims or lack of truth claims. And I was wondering, because Jay's story was omitted, like his direct perspective was like not able to be included in the serial, and the fact that he was targeted so fiercely afterwards, does that kind of imply that maybe serial made a truth claim about like how innocent Jay was because they didn't get his story, and like does that create an ethical problem for Koenig in terms of him being targeted after the series was over?
I mean, I guess what I'm inferring from your comment is, would they have been upset enough by that to cast aspersions on him? Is that what you're asking?
Well, does
What I hear asking is what was the ethical responsibility of This American Life and the producers of the show and how they presented this guy? They made him look guilty.
yes,
What is their responsibility? Do they have any? Is that
because he was targeted so fiercely afterwards, like his omission from the piece.
Right. I mean, as a journalist, you really want to get everybody on the record, or at least get everybody's perspective. It's just plain fair, right? They did try. And one thing I have said, in cases where people don't want to talk to me, is like, don't you want your side of the story to be represented? And then usually that works. It's like one of the last resorts. And the very last resort, often what I say is like, we're going to tell the story with your help or without your help. You will be better represented if you speak. And I mean, in fairness to Sarah Koenig, who as you know, have some problems with some of what she did. I mean, I don't know that. I mean, I think that the report did suffer from the fact that, and I don't remember the specifics enough to know if they suggested things that they shouldn't have. But I think, this is a case maybe to actually have had a fuller conversation with him earlier rather than rolling it out and suggesting he might be guilty and then him not wanting to talk to you because the pieces have been coming out.
Sandy, have you got your mic turned on? Because I can't hear you that well.
Do
Do you have it turned on?
Mine is turned on.
Okay, you need to just pull it up a little bit further.
Yeah.
Mine isn't working at all.
Not working at all. Okay, because I can't hear you. I can hear you now.
1, 2, 1, 2.
No. All right. Did he answer your question?
Yeah.
I sat on
Another question?
it. Okay, here we go.
Maybe you have a hand mic or something?
No.
Here we,
I'm good now.
it sounds like it's sorted out. Very good.
Do we have another question? You turn it on.
you both mentioned kind of like the popularity that this podcast has received. What do you think that says like about the current American culture that this type of like crime news podcast became so popular?
Well, I think there are two ways we could think about this. One is to say that it's popular because it's a morbid obsession with a crime. And we can say that that's consistent with the things that are happening across the entertainment scape right now. There's an incredible number of detective shows, both fiction and nonfiction, on American television and American media at the current time. Maybe it's no accident that True Detective and Serial came out the same year, for example, and I think it's interesting to look at those two things, both long-form investigations of a single case, one fictional, one non-fictional, but we could read it as part of an obsession with crime, truth, proof. We can connect it to the current attempt to understand law enforcement and racialize law enforcement in America today, which is also leaving us skeptical, eager to probe behind the scenes. If you think about what happened to the grand jury report that came out of Ferguson and the number of people who probed into that and really wanted to try to figure out what happened at a grand jury, there's a larger phenomenon here about crime, which could be seen as morbid or could be seen as part of a larger skepticism about how law and order is working in America today. take a step back and say there's a fascination with puzzles and problem solving in the media, which I've been arguing has come out as long as we've had networked communication, as long as we have people who want to get together and think with strangers about things. We've seen a hunger for complexity in storytelling. Jason Mattel, who we read, you looked at maybe, Jason has a new book out called Complex Television, which is all about this growing complication of television narrative, ensemble pieces, serialized pieces, multiple perspective pieces, doubling back in time, all part of how we tell stories. And I started noticing, the first thing I really looked at in terms of television's intersection with the internet was Twin Peaks, 20-something years ago. And right, every newspaper critic was saying Twin Peaks was becoming impossible to watch because it was so complex. And everyone on the discussion boards were spending hours every week discussing it. We're saying Twin Peaks was becoming boring to watch because it was too simple. Yeah. Right? And you come to realize that a single critic sitting in their living room cannot handle the level of complexity that 1,000 people online pooling knowledge and comparing notes and debating interpretations need in order to go forward. So that's the sense in which we can call this a kind of pushpin bulletin board kind of show. What's exciting about Serial was so many moving parts, so many interesting questions, so many timelines, so many clues. And so we could picture Serial taking a totally different kind of story next year that's not crime related at all, but is getting deep for a year-long, season-long story and has lots of movable parts and people being every bit as obsessed with it. So I'm not 100% sure I want to say what drove people to Serial was just that it was a crime. I think that it was complex and it was shareable, and that people became interested in talking through this together with the people they knew, online and off.
And I would just add, I agree with that, and I would just add that I think it's a very encouraging signs for people who like to tell long-form stories, I would be one of them, that there's engagement with that there's a hunger. I think it was David Halberstam, the late David Halberstam, who said the most beautiful words in the English language for a journalist is, what happened next? And that's what everybody is asking with these, and why they kept downloading, why they kept listening, because they wanted to know what happened next.
So I have a hand here and we have one in the back.
One of the ethical issues that I saw with this piece that I haven't heard either of you talk about is the idea of, like, they are talking about a murder of a girl, and in the sense, like, we don't know that Adnan Syed was innocent in this. And a lot of her coverage, even though she says that she kind of takes a not biased approach to it, suggests more that she believes that he was innocent. From a journalistic perspective, do you think there's like a breach in ethics from the perspective of there is a dead girl in this situation and he could have been the killer, and she so, you know, almost vehemently searches for his innocence?
Well, I don't know. I mean, the fact that there, a lot of people have praised, I think rightly, her transparency. She says right away that she was called by the sister, and that the lawyer was apparently derelict or did not do certain important things in the original murder trial. The appeal was screwed up, and that she's been asked, and she agreed to do it. But she agreed to do it as a journalist. And I think, I mean, she does a lot of hand-wringing, some of which really got on my nerves. But I feel like she actually wasn't sure. And in the end, she says, I don't know. And it disappointed a lot of people. They wanted a conclusion. But I have to say, you know, I applaud her for not reaching a false conclusion just for some sort of narrative wind-up, right? She just didn't know at the end. And I think she thinks maybe he did do it. So I don't know if I agree with that. I don't have a problem with the ethics on that level.
But let me ask you, I just want to follow up,
Yeah.
because there is no discussion of this girl in this piece at all.
Right.
So where's the ethical stance on this? Like, I have many friends who are Korean, and I didn't even know she was Korean. And then when you find out, there's a whole set of blogs in Korean now about how come we didn't know she was a Korean. So the question is, in a story like this, ethically speaking, when you're dealing with someone who is dead, what is the ethical responsibility of the journalist in terms of reaching out to that girl's family at all?
Did they not reach out to her?
I mean, I don't think
I
we
thought
know
they
one
did.
way or another whether they refuse, and that's a problem, right? A
I thought
traditional
they said
journalist
that they did refuse.
would say they
no?
refuse.
No?
I
Yeah,
don't
they declined
remember.
to comment, right? Yeah.
If,
Was there anything more that they need to do than simply say we tried?
well, I mean,
That she did.
to play devil's advocate, I'm
Yeah.
uncertain on this, but
Yeah.
to play devil's advocate here, you could argue that by not drilling into her life, they protected her reputation and innocence. She is the victim here. To drill out every detail of who she was and who she slept with and what her parents were like when she's dead and can't speak for herself, and the story is not centrally about her, might have been more intrusive than bracketing that and saying we're focusing on the crime.
And I would
that's
push
after her.
back because the second episode is all about how they're immigrant kids, and so to me it was relevant, her background. But that's just my
Yeah,
point of
I'm
view.
not sure
Yeah,
how I
yeah,
come down
yeah.
on this,
Yeah,
but
and-
I think you could. But I'm just saying there's a counter argument that we want
No,
away.
I understand. It's a great
What,
thing.
to get back to your question, I mean, one thing I would have done, if I was doing this, I mean, everybody would do it differently, but why didn't they actually check out the alibi of the new boyfriend? I mean, and the manager was his mom or something? I can't remember. It was like, right? So, like, hello, can we just check that out a little more? I dig into it a little more. Because I wonder, I mean, I don't want to cast aspersions on him all of a sudden, but if you're looking at the case, wouldn't you look at it? Is that where racial bias comes in? He's a white guy. I don't know.
You could say that.
Yeah, you could.
It could be argued.
Yeah, I could say. I think so. Yeah.
I know we're about to run out of time here, but I want to ask someone to ask a question that deals with how do you get a hold of them later, because we're going to run out of time for you to have all your questions. So, anyone?
If you want to know how to get a hold of me later, just send to hjenkins@usc.edu,
All right.
and I'm happy to get questions from people.
Okay, yeah, we'll take it.
And I'm Sandy
this on?
Tolan, SandyTolan @gmail.
Okay, so I was just wondering, what did you both think about the fact that Serial did not make a great attempt to, nor did they at any point during the podcast feature the viewpoint of the prosecutor, seeing as they spent most of the podcast trying to poke holes in the state's case?
Huh.
Fair criticism.
It is a fair criticism, I think.
I don't know. See, I mean, having listened to it a while ago and not having the chance to re-listen to it just now, I mean, I don't know if there was. Does anybody recall whether they said we attempted to reach the prosecutor to no avail? I don't recall them ever saying that. Does anybody remember?
I'm in the same situation. I listened to it back in December, and it's much fresher for some of you, I suspect, than it is for
Yeah.
us. But
But I mean, if they
Did
did
they
not-
ever say that? Anyone hear that?
I remember they did, and the prosecutor said, over here,
Yeah.
he said he wasn't authorized to talk about it.
Okay, well,
And
there
then
you
they
go.
just left it.
They made their attempt, and if he declined, then there's not much they can do. They might have repeated it once or twice because a lot of us couldn't remember.
Well, they don't repeat anything. They just say it once and go on.
Yeah,
I thought
no,
they
it's-
should have repeated
Yeah.
it every episode. We
Yeah,
tried, and they don't do
yeah,
that.
or at least more
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
yeah, I think that's. I mean, this is the question of how to deal with the long form. That,
Yeah, exactly.
How
I
often
agree.
do you repeat things? What information gets reprised? What doesn't? Are we assuming listeners that listen to the whole thing, or are we assuming it's got to be every episode's got to be self-contained enough that if you only listen to that, you would get a fair representation of the truth? These are things we're still exploring because there hasn't been this kind of long-form
No.
radio
My guess they were
reporting
just figuring
before.
it out themselves too. Yeah. So I got time for one last question. Is that Sebastian in the front?
So I just wanted to pick at this just for 1 second. I don't know if you two heard about the new podcast that came out Monday, Undisclosed: The State versus Adnan Syed.
Yeah.
I knew it was coming. I didn't realize it was already out.
It's out. Yeah.
So I don't know if either of you have heard of that or have heard any of it, but what do you think that means? Because like we talked about, like people kind of giving their own opinions and shooting back ideas on Reddit. What does that podcast kind of mean to this story, or like to any stories in the future as well?
Well, I think we're at an interesting moment where, in theory, any of these people could create their own media. The podcast is such a low-cost form of production that blogs are even easier and lower-cost forms of production, that they're all going into the same mediascape that Serial went into to begin with. So while there's an advantage of having This American Life publicize you, once it's on the web, it's all there. So I suspect we will see in the future lots of examples where people are creating or their own media when they're dissatisfied with representations of their lives that have been constructed by someone else. And so without hearing the piece, I don't want to comment on specifically what it's trying to do, but I think it's illustrative of the kind of communication environment that Serial has come out with, as is the Reddit thing, where not governed by traditional journalistic ethics, not closed, no kind of gatekeeping functions on Reddit. It's a totally different thing, and comes back to this question of genre I'm posing. How do we evaluate what's going on there if it doesn't follow institutional journalistic practices, which is maybe a better way to address, is it journalism or not? I'm describing journalism in particular terms. My own definition's broader as well, but I think it's not following the norms of institutionalized journalism in the American 20th century tradition, because we have to be historically specific as well.
Yeah, right, exactly, and place specific. So different places treat journalism different ways. What's the name of that again? Did you say?
It's called Undisclosed.
Undisclosed.
The state
And
versus a
State
non-site.
versus our not
Okay, and who's the producer of that?
I don't know the producer exactly, but,
but
it's
it's not
three
Sarah
lawyers.
Koenig
It's not
and-
Sarah Koenig.
Okay.
It's three
Well,
lawyers that want to go deeper.
Three lawyers.
I
think you're trying to
I
get
think it's
business.
really interesting because it's sort of like, well, let's hear all the stories. Let's hear everything. Let's hear from and let's be transparent so we can evaluate. Helps us evaluate, right? Let's be transparent and let's get it all. Let's get everybody's perspective. And it's almost like, Better Call Saul comes out of a Breaking Bad, and now this one comes out of Serial.
I want to thank our guests, but I want to say something. A couple of things that Henry said. Henry's talking about new journalism, and he was talking about a certain kind of journalism where the journalists were involved in the story. And I want to point out that actually it's not new. It became new in the 20th century, but we talked about a journalist, Nellie Bly, who did all her work undercover. So that's what he's talking about, reference to that. So it's kind of new journalism, but kind of old journalism. I'd also like to point out that they talk about a lot of things in here about like meeting today. And I will ask one last question about audience. There is somebody studying the audience who looked at Serial, and I know they haven't finished their work yet, but what do you know? What do we know in terms of social science as to who actually listened to this thing?
Yeah, so Jason Mattel and Jonathan Gray are two academics who did a large-scale survey while Serial was unfolding of the audiences. Jonathan's actually in the Peabody jury with me, so I spent a lot of time with him last week. They hadn't had any time to process it and what they collected, and they will do so over the summer, so we can expect to see more stuff coming out of it. Podcasts aren't counted by traditional criteria like Nielsen ratings, right? Or any of the other surveys that might give us objective data on who listened to it. We really only know what they disclose about the actual viewer listening numbers there, and so far have no real demographics to go there. So this will be an imperfect survey. It's self-selective in some other
But
ways.
can you guess?
It'll be interesting. Well,
you
I mean,
guess?
if you start with NPR's listenership, it's going to be upper middle class, college educated, and mostly white.
Right.
That's who listens to NPR.
And that have certain consumption tastes that favor it's a white upper middle class demographic basically. And although there are a lot of exceptions to that, and probably there has been a graying of the NPR audience in recent years. Probably, I don't know what the average age is, but I would suspect that although Serial may have attracted a lot more young listeners.
Yeah, I mean, as a podcast, my bet is that it skews on the younger end.
Yeah.
So that my son and I discovered it more or less the same week in different circles. We were both listening obsessively for a while before it came up in conversation. But my son's closer to your age, a little older, and so my sense is it hit young listeners much more than even something like This American Life, which is on the hipper end of public radio in general. It's broadening a public radio listenership. And my son's gone on to listen to other podcasts and other public radio things based on his discovery of that, which is another fringe benefit, I think.
Yeah.
So we are out of time. I want to tell you guys, thank our guest.
Thank you.
And, I've given you ways to find out how to email them, so your assignment will be to figure out how to do that if you have follow-up questions. So thank you very much. Thank our guest again. I'll see you on Monday. Bye-bye.
That was fun.
Yeah, that's great.